Hi there, I'm Dr. Rob, and you're listening to Dental Formulator's Playbook, where we talk about everything from ideation to market success of oral care products like toothpaste and mouthwash. Along the way, we share stories, histories, and present insight into various topics as they relate to oral care, even ones that might be highly charged. Tips, tricks, and frustrations are promised to be included. Joining me is my wife and sidekick assistant, Tami.
Hello. So I find this interesting. Everyone is familiar with fluoride toothpaste, but not everyone is familiar with where the origins of fluoride. And to understand anything, you really need to understand the history of it. So I thought you would share with us how fluoride came to be the anti-caries gold standard.
Yes, great question, and one that I think is really remarkable and touches intimately on water fluoridation, which has recently come under some fire.
Indeed. Recently, like the state of Utah banning water fluoridation in early May of this year, 2025, or the reports of possible links to IQ, right?
Yes, that's correct. In our previous podcast, we discussed this at length, providing some really important insight, metrics, and data that, based on the standard water fluoridation levels here in the US, again, which is about zero point 0.7 ppm, which pales in comparison to and is way less than that commonly found in green tea, matcha tea, black tea, and decaffeinated teas of those same types. These risks and hence concerns are low. We also discussed the pharmacokinetics of fluoride, which provides an excellent backdrop to this podcast.
Yes, that was a great podcast. Very detailed. And you made some really great points.
Thank you. Well, it's important to give facts, and based on the information circulating in this metaverse social media world, we need to address the origins of fluoride as the gold standard anti tooth decay agent. If we use the term caries, by the way, this refers to the disease state of a cavity and is often interchanged with tooth decay.
That's good to know. I often have to remind myself of that.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so I've lectured about this several times, and one of the common responses shared with me is, why don't we know about this? But no matter, I'm happy to share, so let's jump in on fluoride, and I like to start at the beginning.
A very good place to start.
Haha. Tooth decay has long been problematic. Sugar definitely contributes. Though, at one point, as relayed in a late 18th century publication, The Gentleman's Diary, an 80-year-old patient remarked boldly to his doctor on his great health despite spreading sugar on his buttered bread every morning of his life. No teeth lost until he lost his first one, his first permanent one, there at aged 82. Anyway, this was almost certainly an anomaly as the excesses of sugar were well known by then. Anyway, so beginning around 1900, written observations of mottled teeth were soon published in various journals, magazines, newsletters, all kinds of different pamphlets and such. Sometimes they were peer reviewed, sometimes they were just for fun reading or just of interest. But these reports included, well, observations made in Mexico, North Africa, and in Naples,
Ooh, beautiful southern Italy.
along with the Rocky Mountain region in the United States. A peculiar thing, although the teeth, they noticed, were mottled, which means splotchy patterns on the teeth. So this can look maybe yellow, brownish, all different kinds of colors in between there. Sometimes they would appear black, like those in the Neapolitan population. Although all of this mottling would occur, they were largely free of tooth decay. In fact, the dental researchers here in the United States, Black and McKay, published in 1916 upon observing the teeth of children and adults in Larimer County, Colorado, in the Rocky Mountains. Their enamel comprised what they called browning, their term for mottling, and was brittle, pitted, grooved, and thus ugly. But, like before, few signs of dental caries. It was suspected, they figured, that the runoff from the coarse granites that already unique there, a lot of pegmatites and such, were contributing elements such as lead, fluorine, iron, possibly even magnesium, manganese, all these other things, into the spring waters. And that was what the population was drinking. But just to let you know, it wasn't until 1938, so many years later, by Armstrong and Breckus, that the relationship between mottled enamel, caries activity, and fluoride content could concretely be made.
Okay, but that's a little more than a 20-year gap between the Rocky Mountain observations by Black and McKay and the fluoride relationship. Why is that?
Yeah, another great question. And this is really important because sometimes people feel like, hey, I know it's in my water, and you could just have your water analyzed. Not true. Until that time, there wasn't a rapid and accurate way to measure low levels of fluoride, especially in the water, or even in the enamel. Whether it was in the water or in a tooth or whatever, the ability to readily measure fluoride was a bit elusive. It took some time to develop and optimize a method. That method was a colorimetric method. Think there was like a pinkish color that would result from their compound that they used to understand fluoride. It involves zirconium and alizarin, and we could talk about that separately, but it was sensitive and sufficiently reliable, and it could detect levels less than 1 ppm. So once that method became understood and optimized, then researchers everywhere could make their own assessments into water. And so that began in earnest.
Wow.
In 1932, H.V. Churchill published some of the first studies on fluoride found in water using this technique. The publication found that fluoride was especially common in waters west of the Appalachian Mountains, and it could vary widely depending on where you were, west of those Appalachian Mountains. So, for instance, in Colorado Springs, you'd have about 2 ppm of fluoride there, while in Arkansas and bauxite, Arkansas, the levels might be as high as 13 ppm. There was reasons for that, and that includes, well, byproducts, unwanted byproducts that exist whenever aluminum is extracted by hydrofluoric acid. Runoff ends up filtering into the drinking water supply.
Yeah, let me guess. Lots of modeling.
Yes, definitely, most definitely. And separately, Elvo, this is another researcher in 1933, so a year after Churchill already published, he continued this. And all of this stuff, you could find a lot of this in the public health reports. This journal doesn't really exist present day, but this is where a lot of the different reports on health, epidemiological evaluations, whether it was medical, dental, whatever, were published, observations really. And he published there on municipal water supplies, well waters, spring waters, and so on, and especially in those areas where the fluorides seemed to be more concentrated. So, in 1936, possible connections between fluoride and modeling were made, finally, and they did this. Elvo did this with Trenley Dean, and Trenley Dean is a really important figure in the water fluoridation history because not only did he later become the director of the National Institute of Dental Research, but he was also a dentist from Michigan who had advocated for water fluoride testing once some of this data came out on, well, wait a minute, you can actually still have fluoride in water and it could provide a potential caries benefit, an anti-caries benefit. And Black himself, back in 1916, who actually published on that population in Colorado, he was the one who told and really urged on Dean to say, hey, look, we really need to understand this because, again, maybe there's a sweet spot. The mottled teeth, after all, they were ugly, but they didn't have decay. So, Dean ran with that. Dean and Elvo worked together, and a lot of others then continued to contribute to this, and they would report on the different water supplies, the different modeling that was observed, and basically the caries experience that that population had. Whenever they created new water supplies to test some of these observations
Mm-hmm.
and their hypothesis to say, well, maybe there was a sweet spot, they found that there was less fluorosis and there was also still less caries, even if the fluoride was lower. But they didn't have a full understanding of this, and so they started the 21 city water fluoridation experiment. It began in the 1940s, carried through World War II era, and with Grand Rapids, Michigan becoming the first test site in 1945. Now, to be able to optimize and to be able to kind of calibrate and say, well, what fluoride levels were there, they actually had to drill the well waters, like to be able to get certain specific level of fluoride that they wanted to test.
Okay, well that's fascinating. So the productive or protective, I'm sorry, effects of fluoride were observed based on modeling and fluorosis. I assume all of this effort was used to determine a quote unquote optimized level of fluoride.
Yes, that's right. This was published later in 1950. They had a bevy of data, at least 10 years of data, that showed hey, you can have maximum protection and minimum toxicity concerns. Toxicity being, in this particular case, the amount of fluorosis. So, max protection, minimum toxicity at about 1 ppm fluoride water level.
Okay, so that helps explain water fluoridation. I would think that the benefits of fluoride against caries likely kickstarted use of topical applications.
Yeah, that's right. So water fluoridation, just to be clear, came before any kind of take home toothpaste, any kind of mouthwash, any kind of treatment. And it even came well before any kind of organized fluoridation treatment. So sometimes later, especially in the 50s and 60s, they would have the school students participate in fluoride preventive trials. If they couldn't get, for instance, if let's say the families didn't have water wherever they lived, but at school you have a mass collection of children
Hmm.
and they could be supervised by the teachers and stuff. And so you could have frequent treatments of fluoride, administered by a dentist or a hygienist. They would come in and they would help that. So that became really popular. But you're absolutely right. Yeah, water fluoridation came before fluoride toothpaste. Any kind of topically self-administered or professionally administered fluoride in the mouth. So yeah. So what kickstarted all that, right? Yeah. So anyway, a preliminary report was published by Shane in 1942 in the Journal of the American Dental Association, and it was based in Indianapolis, Indiana, on the in office administration of quarterly fluoride treatments to children between the ages like 4.5 to 6. And they used 500 ppm fluoride. This time they used the potassium fluoride source. And they looked at them, then they made these assessments over the course of a year. And they found that there were twice as many caries free tooth surfaces relative to the fluoride free group that received no fluoride in their topical application.
Okay, so first of all, there's another Indianapolis, Indiana connection, which is awesome because that's where we are. But the teeth treated with fluoride then showed less caries or decay. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right. And there's going to be more Indiana connections here too. So separately, another report was published by a researcher named Bibby. So Bibby was a very prominent Boston researcher, a dentist and a researcher, and he did a number of different studies. It's important that I point him out because he later became hugely important to one of the global manufacturers that everybody knows you know, by the familiar name Colgate, right? So he was really instrumental in trying to develop not only studies but in trying to assess data, but he also participated in what ended up being contributions to the FDA's monograph on topical fluorides. He wasn't the only one, but he was part of this whole effort. And Bibby, unfortunately, during this time, a tremendous researcher, no doubt, he was experiencing a lot of failure. So the failure, one of the example, well, we'll get to his failures, but one of the successes that he had before his failures was that in 1942 he also published at the same time that Shane did, and he also reported that just like Shane observed a caries reduction in children, he observed that also for those between 10 and 13 years old, and they had received 1,000 ppm treatments quarterly per year. So Shane had used half that, right? 500 ppm, but 500 ppm seemed to work. 1,000 ppm won't seem to work. And importantly, there didn't seem to be any off target effects of that. So no negative responses. So the toxicity concerns, which continued to be evaluated for fluoride, weren't manifested at all. Nothing presented itself as untoward in any of these children during that time.
So, just to be clear, you mean fluoride, especially in the beginning, was only applied by clinicians, say dentists or hygienists, but not the individual. The individual's not putting it on their own teeth.
Yes, that's correct. It would only be from the dental professional. So whether it was a hygienist, an assistant, a dentist, heck, even a medical doctor could probably do it, But the important thing is fluoride was not yet given to somebody for unsupervised use. So that had to have been executed administered in a dental office or a medical
Okay,
office.
so it's an in office treatment, but why?
Several reasons: safety and efficacy. They wanted to make sure that that was optimized, and they also wanted to reduce the risks of spoilage. What that means is that these solutions would be freshly prepared.
Okay.
So it'd almost be like compounding. Some pharmacies offer compounding where the final treatment that, prescription or whatever you're wanting is going to be made at the pharmacy and then it's going to be sent to you, or, you buy it, whatever, they're at their counter at their headquarters or whatever. But in this particular case, the dentist or the dental researchers, whoever was doing this, they would make up their solutions and then they would administer it, there. Spoilage is one of those things where we are going to talk about much later in other podcasts about preservation of formulations. And this is a challenge. So right now, it was still relatively new. They wanted the dentist to have control of it. They didn't want the child to accidentally drink a bottle of fluoride stuff just because they didn't know. Although there weren't any untoward effects, they knew at minimum that having too much fluoride in the body would lead to fluorosis. So they knew that
Yes.
there was already a concern there. So they were trying to be responsible, and they also wanted to make sure that the teeth got sufficient contact with the fluoride. So, yeah, so all of that was done in the office. Nothing still was made available for the consumer.
Okay, well, so that's how it started, but obviously that's changed. We all brush our I hope we all brush our teeth every day. So when did that happen?
Yeah, so this it took a long time, and I mentioned Bibby had faced some frustration. So after he had the success of saying, "Hey, 1,000 ppm fluoride, yeah, that mirrors other studies, and we were observing that there are some clinical benefits here, meaningful benefits of caries reduction whenever they're applied in solutions. What about compounding something in a mouthwash or in a toothpaste, and let's conduct some clinical trials?" So we started that. Unfortunately, they failed.
Wait, what? It really?
Yes, and I think that this must have been a point of immense frustration, especially for Dr. Bibby. I mean, he published later, so he had been working on this in the 30s minimally, and he published later in the 1940s in the Journal of Dental Research, and he touched on his frustrations with this. Like these are his frustrations, not we're not thinking that oh, he must have been frustrated. He was, in his own words,
Yeah.
talking about this. He said it was so frustrating. We're getting these clinical benefits whenever we do it. But as soon as we start having unsupervised use and these formulations, it's failing. What is going on? And, you know, one example of this was mouthwash that was used up to 2 years by children, or there were toothpaste studies used by dental students or even Coast Guard cadets. And despite the longevity of these trials, I mean, trials don't even go that long today. It's hard for us to think about that, about it like a 2 year trial on something for the oral care. But these trials were done all the time on different active ingredients. And again, here we're only focused on fluoride. Man, there were so many other potentially active ingredients that were being investigated. This is just a small subset of what's going on. So there was lots of stuff. But yeah, so it didn't work.
Okay, so that seems to be a huge problem. The fluoride applications in office, like in the dental offices, worked, but made for home formulations did not. That's perplexing.
Yeah, and there's gonna be a couple problems, but let me just tell you about one of the mouthwashes, for instance, the one that they use in children. They thought they were doing the right thing. They were using a mouthwash that had a pH of 4, so
Okay.
definitely acidic. Just so
Yes.
that everybody knows, demineralization or destruction of the enamel structure starts to begin around pH of 5.5. So if
Okay.
you're in that area, then you're gonna start having those kinds of issues,
And our typical
right?
pH in our mouth is
It's around 7
okay.
or so. So these are big differences,
Yes.
But there was a purpose. They knew from experiments that if you drop the pH, you can actually deliver more fluoride into the tooth. This is supremely important, and actually, this will play into formulation design again that we will talk about in the future. But even then, they knew that low pH would favor fluoride uptake into the tooth. They figured more fluoride into the tooth. Fluoride makes the tooth less soluble, more resistant to acid attack. Why not use an acidic treatment?
Okay.
The problem was there was no difference in the control, the one that had like a pH 4 solution that didn't have fluoride versus the ones that had it. And they weren't really, like, they knew it was going to be a potent thing, but they really didn't know how potent it was until the landladies of the dental students that were staying in the dorms and the homes and such, whenever they were cleaning the sinks, they found that the sinks had severe etching in, from use of whatever products they were,
Oh
you
wow.
know, the students were using. They didn't know for sure it was the mouthwash, but
That's
separate
intriguing.
studies, they were like, oh wow, yeah, I guess this was pretty potent stuff. So I think that was a little bit frustrating, and yeah, again, it just didn't matter. The pH was part of the problem. It was an acidulated fluoride that was insufficient. The problem was, and what's available now, which had which has now been corrected, is that it wasn't suitably buffered. So
Okay.
by putting some phosphate in the formulation, that helped buffer the potency of that pH. So it wouldn't demineralize the structure too much.
Okay.
So with a little bit of phosphate in there, again, this has everything to do with formulation and understanding buffers and stuff. But they they weren't understood. All of that wasn't fully understood. Colgate now even sells an acidulated phosphate fluoride rinse. It's
So they
called,
must have figured it out.
well, they figured it out, and other research too in the 60s and 70s continued to promote this because, again, everybody knew you could deliver more fluoride whenever the pH was acidic.
Okay.
And that was an extreme goal, you know. And so the acidulated phosphate fluorides became popular, and they're, I mean, you can still even use them today, even in the U.S. and certainly outside the U.S. You know, as long as they're buffered appropriately, the damaging effects can be mitigated. Maybe
Okay.
not completely, but you're actually going to get a better benefit. It's not like you're going to have, you
The
know,
the
the same
benefits
benefit.
outweigh the risks, in other words.
Yeah, and at the time, it was really funny. Probably because it wasn't super available at the time. Like now, dental researchers all around the globe are focused on dental erosion. And erosion is not a disease. Like caries is the disease, and caries inherently means that you have bacteria, they digest fermentable carbohydrates like sugar, they produce acids, and the acids in turn erode, well, I should say demineralize the enamel. But what if you don't have bacteria involved? What if you drink a can of Coke or some Pepsi? What if you have orange juice? What if you have Jolly Rancher candies?
All acidic.
All of that is acidic, and that doesn't necessarily, in that, and while they may have some sugar, it doesn't need sugar in order to create the acids. The acids themselves are damaging enough that it can thin the enamel all by itself.
So the acids present in foods and drinks are what was doing the damage, not necessarily the sugars and the acids caused from the bacteria.
In the scope of a dental erosion, yes. In this particular
Yes.
study, it
Okay.
was the mouthwash because it had low pH, and the pH was such that it was sufficiently low to cause demineralization, again, below 5.5,
Right.
for any kind of demineralization of the hydroxyapatite like mineral of human enamel. And it wasn't properly buffered. And they were probably getting removal even of any potential carious lesion. In other words, it's kind of similar to how a dentist will prep your tooth. So
Okay.
if you have decay and you need a filling, for instance, the dentist first probably uses phosphoric acid to etch the decay out of that tooth. It wears down the enamel because you need nice, healthy, clean surfaces to bond with.
Okay.
And so once he etches that out, now you're back to clean, sound, healthy enamel, and then they put the restorative material in place. So
Okay.
in essence, you know, that could have been one of the reasons. Now, I'm just speculating here. I wasn't involved in those studies, but
Right.
obviously,
It might
right?
have
I mean,
been.
that was a long time ago. But those are some of the concerns that we have to look out for. Dental erosion. So if you have a product, it better not be too acidic. And if it is acidic, it better be well buffered
Okay.
because it could actually lead to some different
So
problems.
there's nuances.
There are nuances. And that followed up with three separate Denifer studies that all showed no benefit. Again, this was the stuff with on that was tested on the Coast Guard cadets. It was with the dental students. And interestingly, those used about 500 ppm of fluoride in those systems. But you know what? They figured, well, it doesn't work. Maybe because in all those three studies, they were involving older patients,
Okay.
those that were at least 17, all had permanent teeth. They figured, well, maybe the age of the tooth wasn't ideal. Like they didn't know about why the dentifrice necessarily was failing. They just thought, well, maybe these people aren't just fundamentally aren't going to benefit from topical fluorides because they're just too old. The tooth is too old. Yeah, so it wasn't optimal. So the conventional wisdom was that only children would benefit regularly from topical fluoride applications, and the effect would be then greatly reduced for adults.
Wait a minute. That's not true, is it?
No, that's not true.
Oh, okay.
We have benefit of this, of course, in hindsight, but by the end of the 1940s, heading into the early 50s, there was much doubt and frustration. Again, Dr. Bibby was not a poor researcher, and other researchers also. I'm just singling him out because he was a pioneer in this field. He was
It's
a
been
huge
maddening for
figurehead.
him.
Yeah, and that's why he wrote at the end of 1948, I don't understand what's going on. You know, maybe we'll have to repeat these studies. At one point, they even figured, well, maybe World War II, had interrupted some of the testing. Perhaps he thought he didn't know.
Okay.
They were just trying to figure it out. But we have to give them a break, though. These challenges are reasonable, especially for any kind of emerging technology, which fluoride was. There was always bound to be hiccups, and this is a great example of this. And It turns out it happens to be the twofold problem. I already mentioned number one was a formulation issue. The second problem is it was a dosing issue. Contributing to the failures of dentifrices, in retrospect, it seems they underestimated how much fluoride was needed, which inherently becomes diluted in the mouth during toothbrushing. We'll talk about this when we talk the difference between mouthwashes and toothpaste and such, but there is a dilutive effect, and this is due to flavors. This is due to the saliva generated through the action of brushing,
Okay.
stimulated by the sweeteners, by the brushing action itself, of course, surfactants that cause the foaming, flavors, things like this.
Okay.
And so, for instance, like a mouthwash doesn't have the brushing, you just swish, right? It's pretty concentrated,
Right.
So these are the nuances that weren't well understood at that point. And even few, even to this day, few understand the nuances of working with various fluoride sources, let alone the format, whether it's a toothpaste or mouthwash. For instance, why use sodium monofluorophosphate versus sodium fluoride versus stannous fluoride versus ammonium fluoride and
Okay,
on.
so there's a lot of
Yeah, there's
fluorides.
there's just a lot of different fluorides, and so we have to understand that they all probably have pluses and minuses. And so whenever somebody just talks about fluoride and they say, "Hey, I'm going to have a fluoride toothpaste," or "I don't want a fluoride toothpaste," we have to understand why you don't want that, because there could be something else in that formulation that might be helpful.
One form of fluoride might work a little bit differently than another form of fluoride.
Exactly, and that ties in to now this next Indiana connection and the development, because obviously we all use toothpaste, or we know that it exists even if we don't use it, but we probably should. All during this time, and especially at the close of World War II, there was a researcher at Indiana University named Joseph Mueller, and he continued to work in his graduate studies studying the various different compounds of fluoride and their effect on enamel. I think he evaluated over 150 different fluoride types.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, that is a lot. And he was just one of the guys. Joseph Mueller, you have William Nebergall, and then you have Harry Day. Those three guys came together, and they were able to what ended up being a kickstart into a novel formulation of a fluoride toothpaste. Two of them are in the Inventors Hall of Fame, Mueller and Nebergall.
Very cool.
But all three had recognized contributions. Do you want to know what their contributions were?
Of course.
Okay, so first, we'll say this. All three of those guys, and while Mueller was based in Indianapolis, the other two were in Bloomington in the chemistry department. So they weren't
Okay.
all dentists and they weren't all chemists, but they all ended up working together. So that the two different campuses, they were trying to figure stuff out. And the dental school, while originally in Bloomington, it would later move to Indianapolis, and but the research would continue. They figured out a way to make a very high pure stannous fluoride system. So one of the questions that, or problems, I guess, that they encountered was the fact that they couldn't get very pure fluoride sources.
Okay.
And they figured, well, maybe that's causing some stability issues in the formula. Maybe that's causing some of these, failures for some of these other clinical trials that are showing that. So they said, okay, why don't we just create our own, we're just going to, you know, synthesize the stannous fluoride. And so they published that in the American Chemical Society in 1952. And they took stannous oxide and hydrofluoric acid, and then they just made, a highly pure stannous fluoride formulation from that.
So I know you've mentioned before in formulation, the purity of any substance could really have an impact.
Yeah.
So they learned this early.
Yeah, and they focused on stannous fluoride.
Okay.
Why stannous fluoride? Well, stannous fluoride provide the best inhibition of demineralization, the best resistance to
Okay.
acid attack on enamel. That's what Joseph Mueller found. And he was of the opinion, again, based on his research, that not only was the fluoride part important, but the stannous ion itself was also important. So it wasn't a conversation just about fluoride, it was also stannous.
Okay.
The tin part, by the way, that's what everybody would recognize, I guess, in lay language. It's tin fluoride, right? But stannous is the formal name of tin and such. Yeah, so so that was one of the biggest developments that they made. So, by the way, I guess I should mention this now. Mueller ended up working with George Stuckey whenever George Stuckey matriculated into the dental school in the early 60s to study teeth and get his graduate degree. George Stuckey, who was, again, one of my mentors, one of my,
Wow.
mentors, he worked under Joseph Mueller. And so he got a lot of exposure to what worked and didn't work and all the
He was there at the beginning.
he was there very near the
Very near.
beginning, very near.
That's so cool.
It was, I Mueller had to get established in the dental school, so his research. I know, maybe this is of interest, but I mean, I think it is. So Mueller's research as a graduate student continued into the late 40s, and he didn't get his degree until 1951. Okay, but by that time, Procter and Gamble, which was in nearby Ohio, still is. They became very interested in his research, and they started to
Oh,
fund some of his research. And so that became hugely important. So Mueller then, after he graduated from Indiana University, became faculty of Indiana University School of
hmm.
Dentistry and continued these studies. And so, he was one of the mentors of George
With the
Stuckey.
continued support of Procter
Yep.
and Gamble.
And had the support of Procter and
Okay.
Gamble. Very important. All of this was done, only with respect to the stannous fluoride. We're thinking of, well, how do we get protection from this ingredient fluoride, whether it's stannous fluoride or whatever. Separately, Nebergall, who I mentioned, accidentally
Wait.
discovered a compatible or the most compatible form of calcium phosphate that would end up making the abrasive system.
Okay, so I'm thinking accident chemist. That might not have been a great thing.
Well, and you hear this
It's
all too
very
often. You hear this all too often, sometimes mistakes can lead to good things, right? Or small enough
just
accidents,
the accidents.
Yeah, like oversights and such. And this was one of the cases. A graduate student had left a calcium phosphate material in an oven at a high temperature overnight by accident. And the next day came back and, well, they had a high temperature form, a pyrolyzed form. And when they happened to combine it with the fluoride, they found that it could provide, whenever they did their lab testing, when they combined this novel type of calcium phosphate with fluoride, it actually would boost the demineralization, benefits, the anti-demin benefits of stannous fluoride. You see, that brings us to the other point, right? Where fluoride and calcium don't tend to play nice.
I remember you saying that many times.
So if you didn't heat treat this particular calcium phosphate abrasive, the calcium would end up binding all or
Okay.
most of the fluoride to then render it ineffective. When they found this heat treated form, again by accident, and they tested, they found, hey, it didn't inhibit fluoride's action.
Oh,
So
that's cool.
that became really important. In fact, there was a patent there, and that is what Nebergall actually, was known for, and that's why he's in the Inventors Hall of Fame, is for this heat-treated form of calcium phosphate. That patent was filed in '53, and now they had essentially the bulk of the composition for the toothpaste. In other words, an abrasive would be about 40% of the toothpaste. And if you have an active that can be compatible with it or compatible enough, then you're almost there in making a formulation. Now you just gotta, you know,
Tweak it maybe.
tweak the humectants and some of these sweeteners. And that's also what Mueller did. So he also
Okay.
did that. He got a patent for this later in '66, where he was looking at different combinations of sugar alcohols like sorbitol and glycerin, mannitol, these different ingredients that would maybe be a candidate for a stannous fluoride, high temperature calcium phosphate system. And he stumbled upon good ratios, and he said, yeah, you can use
Wow.
sorbitol, maybe glycerin, certain ratios, or, you just got to put it in a certain way. And all of a sudden you have a compatible and a potentially effective dentifrice. They knew this because they did laboratory studies prior to going to any kind of field trial,
Okay.
clinical trials. That's how you screen, and that's how we do our work
Yeah.
whenever we formulate, and that's how the major players in this industry do that. They create their formulations based on performance, so that that, yeah, it might taste great, right? We know that's one of the major reasons why somebody likes a product, but it
Right.
also has to work. And the major companies that you can think of, your Procter and Gamble's, your Colgate's, even the Haleons with the Pro Enamel, they test their products, and they design these with performance in mind. And that's what we do, and that's what we advocate.
So before going to a really lengthy clinical trial that you could possibly lose 2 years on, they have ways in the laboratory to kind of test and figure out these
Absolutely.
formulations to see if they're going to have any kind of positive
Yes,
effect.
absolutely. And so Mueller was on the ground floor with some of these studies showing,
These
um,
laboratory
that these
tests.
laboratory tests could potentially have a benefit. So again, so we're talking the early 50s, right? So
Wow.
Mueller joined the faculty of 51. His research was progressing. Procter and Gamble was funding it. Now it's time to do clinical field trials. They
Okay.
had the abrasive. So you could actually now make a toothpaste that you could give to at-home
Okay.
evaluations. And so that's what they did. So the very first one that was published was in 1954. This was the first study that they published, and it was on children. And what they did in this study was perfect. And this is my biggest concern with anybody who's advocating hydroxyapatite, nano or not, in field trials. You have to do like to like comparisons,
What do you mean?
meaning that whenever they gave two toothpastes to these students, so in other words, it was 514 children, they were absolutely identical in the formulation components. Same
Except,
abrasive, same flavor, same surfactants, same humectants. Everything was the same, except for one had stannous fluoride and one did not.
which is a great way to figure out if your product, your active per
Look,
se, is
in,
going to be effective.
yeah, because ingredients interact with each other and they interact with the environment in which they're introduced, And this is an underappreciated and frustrating, aspect that, they knew this, and that's how pharmaceuticals are made. For
That's
instance,
good
if you want
studies.
to, yeah, and this, I mean, the whole pharmaceutical industry is based on this. You can't just say, well, I'm just going to take one hydroxyapatite toothpaste and compare it completely independently to a complete different formulation that may or may not have fluoride and say, hey, ours works well. Don't do that. You're not doing the industry a service. We'll talk about hydroxyapatite later, but going back to this is how fluoride became the gold standard, and how you become a gold standard and a viable option in helping against diseases is you have well-designed studies. You have proper formulations. You know what to look for, right?
Well
And
designed studies are really
you do your
the
dose
crux of it.
responses. Yeah, you do your dose responses. You understand what the dosing is, and you understand, well, who is it for? Anyway, going back to this 1954 publication, that was a result from a 6-month study in children between 6 and 15 years old.
Okay.
They received a toothpaste, either that had fluoride or it didn't. And not only the children received it, but their parents did. The whole household did. So Procter and Gamble funded this study. And so they outfitted the entire family with the same toothpaste just to make sure there wasn't any crossover bleed in from any other products that maybe mom or dad like to use, or maybe the older brother or younger
Right.
sister, if she was using something non-fluoridated, and
Hmm.
whatever be the case. Everybody used the same product at home, unsupervised, of course, unless mom is watching somebody. But you're talking about 6 to 15. It's
They can brush your teeth,
yeah, they
right?
could brush their teeth.
So would this be the first time for this at home, like, so this study that you're getting to is like really an at home version, not going into the office and getting a fluoride treatment,
Yep,
but
that's
an
right.
at home.
Yeah, this was again, while there were other studies that involved kids. Maybe they were in orphanages, maybe they were in
Okay.
school systems and such. They all had either lower fluoride concentration,
Hmm.
formulations that they were being used, but really this was from a children using it unsupervised and having everybody have the same product. Yeah, this would be one of the first, if not the first study
Okay.
that did this, and the fluoride concentration that they settled on was 1,000. So while Bibi had reported before, like they used maybe 500 ppm,
Mhm.
here they used 1,000. And everybody listening, the reason why this is important is because the FDA monograph stipulates a minimum level of fluoride that is found in fluoride toothpaste. 500 is not that level.
Okay, so they have to have a certain amount of fluoride
Yeah,
for it to be considered effective.
they didn't know that at the time, but this is the background
Okay.
that had led to the shaping of the FDA monograph for fluoridated dentifrices
Okay.
or mouth rinses, things like this. But for fluoride dentifrices, the monograph claims, 500 is really insufficient. So you don't have clearance on that. Anyway, going back to the kids, they use it for 6 months, and it was evaluated by x ray So dentists would actually look at the X-rays of the teeth, and they also had examiners also in the mouth giving scores to whatever kind of decay that they found at the different surfaces, if they did. What they found is that there was a 71% reduction in that 6 month period for those children that had been using the Stannis fluoride toothpaste.
So success.
So success, and because of that success, this is what you have. No cavities. I just played you a short clip of the ad. I will play it again in just a minute, like the rest of it. That was one of the first advertisements that Procter and Gamble then launched in 1956. So the study came out in 54, and you just go full tilt on trying to get into market. We'll talk about that more in a minute because we have one more study that we have to talk about.
Okay.
Now they know, and this is the first publication that showed that kids could use an at-home dentifrice and have a great benefit, an anti-caries benefit. What about adults? So they looked at dental students,
Okay.
anywhere between the ages of, well, 17 and 36 years old. In fact, they were like in their first year of dental school. So sometimes you would have older adults too in dental school. It take all walks of life, right? And again, the same toothpaste were used. Identical, except for one had fluoride and one did not. They use it for 6 and 12 months.
Okay.
And measurements, again, x-rays, examiners, and they looked at the different tooth surfaces and they calculated out if they had decay and how much if they did, or if they didn't, were there any differences between the groups? And it was statistical, and there was a 50 and 42% reduction at the 6 and 12-month period for adults on the Stannis fluoride toothpaste.
So this is very unlike those early trials.
Yeah, so this is the outcome in particular is most impressive. It seems like they got a grasp on how do you create an at-home toothpaste. There was an opinion by Mueller in particular who said sodium fluoride has too many problems. It binds with everything. So that was also one of the reasons why he wanted to go to Stannis fluoride.
Okay.
But Stannis has its own challenges, and we're going to be talking about that in another episode because again, all these fluoride sources cannot be treated alike.
And there's more than one source that's used.
There's more than one source that is used. And in the US, the monograph calls for 3 different types, either sodium fluoride, monofluorophosphate, or Stannis fluoride.
Okay.
And there's different indications and benefits and challenges with each one. And so we will talk about that. But this is it's not as simple as what people think. You know, one of the more frustrating things about formulation and just research in general, and this really, you know, this is better understood now by dental researchers, but if you have a new product out there or if you have new scientists trying to figure out, they don't know. They don't know some of these nuances, some of these intricacies. And really they should, because it does everybody a service to know what has been done. You know, too many times I see, even in recent publications, they say, oh, well, that data is old. It was done in the 1930s, 1960s. Heck, even in the 1980s, they'll say we have better technology now. The stuff we have now, I mean, this is, you know, 21st century. We have so much more knowledge now. They look what they were using. They laid the groundwork and they still use the proper controls and they use the correct method, and a proper scientific method and approach does not age. It does, you know, you can't say, well, now we have a
way
better
to do it, right?
In fact, one could argue exactly that if you don't do that right way, if you don't do something that is going to be reasonable and of good design, then, you know,
it can be considered
cracks.
bad science.
Yeah, cracks can come in, doubts can be started, and, you know, and it just doesn't work. So I don't believe that it was one of these, you know, oh, that was old stuff. This is old technology. And again, I'm talking about scientific papers. I see these comments being made about fluoride detection or fluoride toothpaste or, well, we need something new. Not necessarily. I mean, you know, we still drink water fundamentally. I mean, water is at least as old as humans, if not older. So obviously it is. It had to be, right? But it's just crazy. But anyway, so all of this. So yeah, 2 clinical studies show that a Stannis fluoride toothpaste at home, first of all, can be made. I think that that is one of the first milestones. There's like, I would say there's probably like 5 milestones if I had to rank these. You know, that's probably the number one. You don't need to go to the dentist office to get your anti-caries protection. You can do this at home on a daily basis in an unsupervised manner. Number one, that's huge. Number two, an active appears to have promise. That active being fluoride, in particular, stannous fluoride in this case. That's two because right now and until then, they didn't have a good anti-caries active ingredient. I mean, if people knew about water fluoridation, we had to get that first. That's where all this started. Remember, was
Is the
about
basis
fluoride.
for
Yes.
getting an at-home toothpaste.
Yep. Number three, there was conventional wisdom that only fluoride toothpaste or topical fluorides or water fluoridation, whatever it was going to be, could only help children. And it's false. Absolutely false. So now it can provide benefits as you continue to age.
Basically, it doesn't matter if you have your primary teeth or your secondary teeth. It can provide benefit to whatever teeth are in your mouth, basically.
That's right. And, you know, if everybody can use it, then you can have ads like this. And again, I'm going to continue to play the Procter& Gamble ad
Okay.
for the toothpaste.
No new cavities. Why, that's wonderful.
Not to me either. I guess this Crest toothpaste really works.
Yes, Crest really works for grown-ups and children, right down to your very youngest. Because only Crest has Fluoristan, a special fluoride formula. Fluoride, you know, is the decay fighter dentists use. The decay fighter dentists put on teeth to prevent cavities. With Crest, you put this same fluoride on your teeth at home, too, every time you brush. That's why Crest can cut your family's cavity rate almost in half. Yes, when you switch to Crest with fluoride, you can prevent about half your family's cavities. And for stopping mouth odor, no toothpaste beats Crest. So switch to Crest. You too may hear.
Wow.
Yeah, the Look Ma No Cavities ad was huge. And they mentioned at the malodor, too, at the end of that ad. I think it's helpful for perspective. Most of the dental manufacturers were only focused on that. That's what they could target. Nobody wanted to have a foul mouth. Again, we'll talk about that when it comes into advertising and some different things because it's really important what could be addressed.
Okay, right.
Nobody at that time had an anti-caries solution, and you just heard that in that ad. So that ad is, you know, we're not trying to plug for Procter& Gamble. What we're trying to do is to show that that was historical from that perspective. And
They're
this,
first.
yeah, and this became a serious line of just, you know, frustrations, and it became a huge touch point. No different than water fluoridation. I mean, Congress was even convened to hear complaints brought forth by the American Dental Association about manufacturers attacking consumers with false ads or ads that had false data or that were creating diseases that could be fixed. So this was a huge deal, and I couldn't even imagine that that was going to be an issue. But in the 60s, it became a major issue. And again, you know, George Stuckey, again, one of my mentors, he came up. He was, you know, getting his education, and he also stayed on at the School of Dentistry. And the success of all of this, the research, all the different models, whether it's laboratory testing or clinical testing, and the success of the Procter and Gamble Crest original toothpaste generated royalties that came in to build the dental school's testing apparatus. And this testing apparatus became so big and so powerful that all of the manufacturers ended up turning to them for their laboratory and clinical testing needs, whether it was a Colgate, whether it's the Pro Enamel.
Wow.
You know, the precursor to that, of course, was GlaxoSmithKline. Before that, it was Beecham, and you know, so you have Listerine formulated. I mean, all if you could think of a formulation that all those, as well as fundamental dental research and executions on clinical studies, were being evaluated at the IU School of Dentistry. So without that success, then the institute couldn't have been created, and then you know we couldn't have all these you know opportunities. And you know, remember that's where I became knowledgeable, familiar with all of this kind of, well, what is all this testing? That helped shaped my approach to formulation, my approach to research, and that was a good thing. But you know, again, I mentioned that stannous fluoride wasn't perfect. Right before we close here, I'll say we will address this. Stannous fluoride was soon abandoned for sodium fluoride or monofluorophosphate. That takes us into the 80s. And really, one of the reasons is because differentiation, marketing. You know, you have all these players. There are going to be copycats. You have to differentiate yourself. And so that came back into play. And there was more understanding about how to keep fluoride from interacting with certain ingredients. So as the formulation challenges became better understood, then more options became available.
Okay.
Nevertheless, a return to stannous fluoride was done in the mid 1990s, and even to this day, stannous fluoride especially has undergone some significant. I mean, I've been impressed with some of the technology that's come out, especially Colgate has done some really neat things, and I think that there's going to be some other innovations coming out where they've just made the stannous fluoride even better.
So all things old are new again.
All things old, yeah, new again, and it just shows you that you can still advance on stuff that's old, but the same principles apply. You know, if there's going to be a problem, and they already knew this a long time, yeah, that's where you start. You can evolve it, you can make things better, but it doesn't mean that it was bad. You know, so we will be talking about that more in depth. So anyway, this concludes this podcast on how fluoride came to be recognized as an effective anti-caries agent, essentially the one here in the United States. We'll discuss different forms of fluoride, including the different salts and formats, and how these are regulated and therefore marketed in further episodes. Follow this podcast for more information on various aspects of oral care research, products, histories, and formulations. Alongside Tami, I'm Dr. Rob, and thank you for listening to the Dental Formulators Playbook.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao.